Months after the accident, Ann-Margret stood in a doorway leading to a stage, and for a long moment she did not move. Behind her, a hallway of cinder block and exposed pipes led back toward a dressing room that still smelled faintly of fresh paint. Ahead of her, past the heavy curtain, she could hear the low hum of a Las Vegas showroom filling with people. The clink of glasses, the murmur of conversation, the particular sound of an audience that did not yet know what it was about to see. Somewhere beyond that curtain, a stage manager was watching the clock. A band was tuning, quietly, the way bands do when they are trying not to be heard. And Ann-Margret stood in the doorway, one hand resting against the cool cinder block wall, and did not move. It was the autumn of 1972. Just a few months earlier, during a performance in Lake Tahoe, a piece of stage scenery had struck her during a number, sending her down 11 feet onto the floor below. The injuries were serious, to her face, her jaw, her confidence in a way that no doctor could measure. For weeks afterward, she could not perform at all. For weeks after that, she could not imagine wanting to. To understand what that doorway meant, it helps to understand where Ann-Margret had been standing professionally just before it happened. By 1972, she was no longer simply the bright, energetic performer audiences remembered from the early 1960s. She had spent years working to be taken seriously as an actress in dramatic roles, away from the bright lights and the dance numbers. And that work had recently been recognized in a way that mattered to her. A nomination for one of the industry's highest honors for a performance that asked audiences to see her as something more complicated than a girl singer or a Vegas headliner. She had, in other words, reached a point in her career where she was being seen differently. And then, in a single performance, in front of a live audience, everything had changed. Las Vegas in the early 1970s was its own kind of world. Showrooms filled every night with audiences who had traveled from across the country specifically to see performers they had grown up with. Men and women in evening wear, settling into round tables under low lights, waiting for the kind of show that television could not quite replicate. These rooms ran on a particular rhythm. The band started, the lights came up, the performer appeared, and for the next hour, nothing else in the world existed. It was a rhythm Ann-Margret knew better than almost anyone. She had built much of her career inside it. The entertainment world had not been quiet about what happened to her. Newspapers ran updates on her condition. Friends and colleagues sent messages of support. There was, in certain circles, a quiet assumption forming, the kind of assumption people make about performers who have been badly hurt in front of an audience, that she might not come back. That if she did come back, it would be different, smaller, more careful. A version of her that the accident had left behind, walking carefully where she had once moved freely. Ann-Margret had heard that assumption in the careful way people sometimes phrase concern as comfort. And for a long time, lying in hospital rooms and then in quiet recovery, she had wondered if it might be true. The recovery itself was slower than anyone outside her closest circle understood. There were weeks where simply standing for long periods was difficult. There were sessions of physical therapy that had nothing to do with performing and everything to do with relearning balance, coordination, the basic mechanics of moving through a room. For a performer whose entire career had been built on movement, on the confidence of a body that knew exactly where it was in space, exactly how far it could lean into a turn or a drop, this was its own kind of loss, separate from the visible injuries, and harder to explain to people who asked, gently, how she was feeling. But somewhere in those months, in physical therapy sessions, in long days spent simply learning to feel like herself again, something else had been forming too. Not a plan, exactly. Not a strategy for a triumphant return, the kind that gets written up in magazines with words like comeback and fighter. Ann-Margret did not think of herself in those terms, and she did not want anyone else to either. What she had decided, quietly, privately, without announcing it to anyone, was something much smaller than a comeback, and much harder. She had decided that when she returned to a stage, she would not let the accident walk out there with her. Not as a denial, not as pretending it hadn't happened. Everyone in that Las Vegas showroom that night would know exactly what had happened to her, and exactly how recently. The newspapers had made sure of that. What she had decided, instead, was that the accident would not be the show. It would not be the introduction. It would not be the thing the audience was there to watch unfold. If she walked out onto that stage and the audience saw a woman who had survived something, rather than a performer who had simply come to perform, then in some way, the fall would have already won. It would have changed not just her body, but her work, and that, she had decided, was not something she was willing to give it. So in the months leading up to that night, she had asked for one thing from the people producing her return. Not a special introduction, not a moment of silence or a tribute, or any acknowledgement from the stage of what she had been through. She wanted the lights to come up the way they always had. She wanted the band to start the way it always had. She wanted to walk out exactly the way she would have walked out a year earlier, before any of it happened. Not because the year earlier was easy to reach, but because reaching for it, deliberately, was the decision itself. It was a request that worried the people around her. A showroom full of regulars and out-of-town visitors, many of whom had read about the accident in the papers just months before. Wouldn't they expect something? Some acknowledgement? Wasn't there a risk, performers and producers around her gently suggested, that walking out as if nothing had happened might read as strange, even cold, to an audience that cared about her? Some even worried about the opposite problem, that without any acknowledgement, the audience might spend the entire show searching her for signs of what had happened, unable to simply watch the performance in front of them. Ann-Margret listened to these concerns, she understood them, and then she asked for the same thing again. This was the choice she carried with her into that hallway on the night of the show, a choice that had nothing to do with the audience's expectations and everything to do with her own. Stand in that doorway as a woman who had been hurt, waiting for permission to feel ready. Or walk through it as the performer she had always been, and let the audience meet her there, on those terms, rather than the terms the accident had tried to set. For a long moment, in the doorway, neither choice had been made yet. The stage manager, a few feet away, was watching her with the careful patience of someone who had worked with performers long enough to know not to rush this. The band had reached the end of its tuning. Somewhere past the curtain, the murmur of the audience had begun to settle, the way a room does in the seconds before something begins. A stagehand nearby kept his eyes carefully on a clipboard, giving her the privacy of not being watched, even while everyone in that hallway was, in fact, watching. Ann-Margret had spent months in hospital beds and recovery rooms imagining this exact moment. Not the performance itself, but this, the doorway, the threshold. She had imagined it as something she would have to push through, force her way past, the way people talk about facing fear. But standing there, with the cool wall against her hand and the sound of the band behind the curtain, what she felt was not force. It was something closer to recognition. This was simply the next thing. The thing she had decided months ago, in a quiet room with no one watching, that she would do. She stepped forward. The curtain moved, the lights came up, not specially, not differently, exactly as they always had, and the band began the way it always had. There was no announcement, no introduction acknowledging what the audience already knew. Just a performer walking onto a Las Vegas stage the way she had 100 times before, as if the months in between had simply not been part of the show. The audience's reaction in the seconds that followed was not what anyone had predicted. Not the producers who had worried, not the performers who had gently raised concerns, and perhaps not even Ann-Margret herself. There was no gasp, no visible searching for signs of what had happened to her. Instead, there was simply the sound of an audience settling into a performance, the way audiences had settled into her performances for years. They had come expecting, perhaps, to witness something, a survivor, a comeback, a moment of fragility wrapped in applause. What they got instead was a show, and in giving them exactly that, without asking for anything extra in return, Ann-Margret had given them, and herself, something far more valuable than sympathy. As the number went on, something in the room seemed to settle further. The band, which had begun the night carefully, almost cautiously, found its usual rhythm. The audience, which had perhaps arrived with a question in mind, seemed to set that question aside, one song at a time, until it was simply gone. By the time the lights shifted for the next number, the room had become, in every way that mattered, exactly what it had always been on any other night in that showroom. And that, more than any ovation, was the proof that the decision had worked. In the weeks and months that followed, people who had been in that showroom that night would describe it in different ways. Some remembered it as simply a wonderful show, not realizing, until they read about it later, what had preceded it. Others, who knew, would describe a particular quality to the performance, not defiance exactly, and not triumph, but something quieter, a kind of ease that seemed, in hindsight, almost impossible given everything she had been through. Ann-Margret herself rarely spoke about that night in detail. When asked about her return to performing after the accident, she tended to describe it simply, as something she did because it was what she did, because performing was not separate from who she was, and because stepping away from it for any longer than necessary would have meant becoming someone else. She did not describe the doorway, or the moment of stillness, or the quiet decision that had been made months before any of it. But for the people who were there, the stage manager who had waited without rushing her, the band that had played as though nothing unusual were happening, the few colleagues who had gently raised their concerns and then, just as gently, let them go, that night became something they carried with them, not as a story about an accident or even about recovery, but about a kind of quiet resolve that doesn't announce itself, doesn't ask to be admired, and simply does the next thing. In the years that followed, Ann-Margret would return to stages across the country, in Las Vegas and beyond, performing with the same energy and presence that had defined her career from the beginning. The accident became, eventually, a footnote in a much longer story, mentioned occasionally, rarely dwelt upon. But for those who understood what had happened in that doorway, The rest of that career carried a quiet undercurrent. Every performance after that night was, in some small way, a continuation of the same decision, made once, in private, and then simply lived out, night after night, for as long as she chose to walk through that curtain. That is the part of the story most people never hear. Not the fall, not the recovery, just a woman standing in a doorway, deciding, quietly, what kind of performer and what kind of person she was going to continue to be, and then stepping through.